I'll send out an email in a couple of weeks with some of the speakers we already have lined up. But I'm very excited. It's going to be, God willing, everything continues to go well. I'm optimistic it will. We're going to continue to meet. We'll start meeting fully in person beginning this fall. And we'll have 8 programs, dinner beforehand, all the things that I love about 100 Jewish Men, you love about 100 Jewish Men. It's hard to believe this is our last program of our 19th year. So it has gone by really fast. And let's hope and pray this is our last online year we ever have. So I want to first thank my friend Michael Wiesenthal for getting our door prize. So Michael, I'm going to let you do this. And then Michael, if you'll turn the floor over to Paul Katz. I want to thank Paul Katz for securing our speaker this evening. And Paul is going to introduce our wonderful speaker.
It's good to see everybody. You have your raffle tickets in front of you. Did everybody get a raffle ticket? I'll just let you do the drawing. It's a $50 gift certificate to the 401 in Bel Air, by the way. And the winner is 428-6643. There you go. 6643. Perfect. Mazel tov. All right. Okay, so let's do this again. This is for a copy of Linda's book. 2 copies. Well, let's just do 2 raffles. Okay. You ready? 6648, 6635. 6648 and 6635. Got one here. Who's the other? Six, 635. That was you. Okay. 6648. No 6648. Okay. All right. You got the books. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Katz to introduce the speaker.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure welcoming everyone back in person after all these months. So good to see everybody and have the opportunity to schmooze and mix and mingle. And this is a real interesting story. I don't know, did many of you watch 60 Minutes Sunday night? Right. So it was a great introduction. Linda, the timing couldn't have been any better. Well, did you schedule it yourself?
I wish I did.
So anyway, I don't want to tell you too much about the story because that's what Linda specializes in. She's the author of this book, and she's going to talk about her dad's role. She's going to talk about her dad's role as one of the Ritchie Boys. But anyway, I also passed out a flyer that gives you information about how you can order the book. And so anyway, the other interesting thing that I think about too is that, the war's been over for 75 years, but the US got involved 80 years ago. And after all of this time, these unique stories are still surfacing about World War II. And I've read about a couple of other stories too that, maybe in the future we can also explore those events also. But all right, Linda, your turn.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank obviously Paul for arranging this program for Congregation Beth. I hope I'll pronounce it right. Yeshurun and 100 Jewish Men, this group. And obviously from what Paul asked you, some of you did see last Sunday evening's comprehensive 60 minutes feature on the Ritchie Boys, and thus learned the factual context behind my, what I call a novel in stories, A Ritchie Boy. And I'm going to assume that many of you have not read my book, so I'm going to tell you about it. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the background, the context, the research, the history. And I may read just 5 minutes from the book to give you a taste of it. A Ritchie Boy follows the early life of Viennese-born Eli Stoff. After facing widespread anti-Semitism, Eli escapes Austria with his parents in 1938. Within 5 years of arriving in America, he's recruited and trained by the U.S. Army as a military intelligence officer at a secret camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Maryland. This facility is called Camp Ritchie, and it trained thousands like Eli, many Jewish refugees born in Germany and Austria, fluent in the language and customs of the enemy. These young men worked undercover on the European front to help the Allies win World War II, and they became known as the Ritchie Boys. And I'm sure all of this sounds familiar to any of you that saw the 60 Minutes program on Sunday. There's not been a lot up to this point communicated really about the Ritchie Boys, and only those of us like your fellow Jerry Wender, who have relatives who really knew about this sort of secret intelligence group and what they did and how important they were. My father was a Ritchie Boy. His name was Ernest Stern, and my book was inspired by my father. He would be 98 if he were alive today. He died in January of 2017 as I was halfway through my first draft of this book. I do want to emphasize that while my book is fiction, it follows the chronology and some of the true experiences of my father. We can talk more about that later during the question portion. When I was writing my novel, though, and I'm going to show it to you now, I had a framed photo of my dad in uniform. This right here. I think it was his ROTC uniform actually when he was in college, but it was an image that always looked back at me as I sat at my desk to write. I also, another thing you should know about this book is that I chose to structure it as what is known as a novel in stories, or a cohesive linked narrative, where interrelated stories are each told by different characters. And these stories follow Eli Stoff from Vienna to New York, from Ohio to Maryland, and then to war-torn Europe before Eli returns to the Midwest. And while my novel dramatizes the adversity and intrusion of war, ultimately, A Ritchie Boy, as I wrote it, is a tale of identity, of becoming and belonging, of a boy becoming a man, and of Eli's journey from one homeland to another. This novel in stories is filled with the circumstances and people that influenced Eli's life. An early story in my book, called Zelda's Gamble, is told by a character named Zelda Mooney, again, an invented character, who receives a desperate letter in the spring of 1938. She is a poor immigrant and is in no position to help the Stoffs, but somehow finds someone who can provide the family their affidavits to immigrate in 1938, and who takes the financial responsibility as a sponsor that this family does not become a burden of the state. At that point, my character, Eli Stoff, is just a boy of 15. He arrives at Ellis Island, and his family soon relocates to Columbus, Ohio. Paul thought it would be fine for me to briefly read from my book, and I'll do so now. It is the first section from the story called When the Lights Dimmed. This particular story is told by a boy named Herschel Goldstein, who becomes Eli's best friend in America. And it's not even 5 minutes. Herschel would never forget the November day the Stoffs came to live with his family. They had an old world look, like pictures he saw in his history books. Mr. and Mrs. Stoff dressed like Herschel's own Russian grandparents, each carrying a single suitcase, worn tweed with stripes and wooden handles. The mother had an accent, and the father didn't even speak English yet. The boy, Eli, looked to be Herschel's age, 15, with coffee dark eyes that twinkled when he smiled. And Eli smiled a lot. Herschel instantly liked him. For weeks, Herschel's parents had been briefing him and his brother about their temporary guests, how they'd had to leave their home in Vienna, how as Jews they'd been taunted and threatened. Herschel couldn't imagine things bad enough to force his family to leave their house on the east side of Columbus. Sure, some months back, he'd heard Jimmy Braggart call Max Sherman a kike, but Mrs. Grayson had grabbed Jimmy by the ear and set him down on a stool next to her desk for the rest of the period, then had him write an apology to Max and his family. Stuff like that just wasn't tolerated at Central High. Still, some things were accepted, like the housing restrictions, keeping Jews from moving to any neighborhood. It explained why Herschel's family lived in their Jewish enclave, but they were comfortable there. Herschel always felt safe. So nothing had braced him for the panic that erupted all through his neighborhood the same day the Stoffs arrived. As news spread about the looting and destruction of Jewish homes, hospitals, schools, shops, and synagogues in Germany and Austria, they'd called it Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, because of the shards that littered the streets from all the smashed windows. The emerging pictures of Jews being beaten, furniture and goods being flung out of houses and stores frightened them. It immediately bonded his family and the Stoffs, the 7 of them huddled around the radio, listening to the drama unfolding. Herschel's father said it reminded him of the pogroms in Imperial Russia in the late 1880s. Mrs. Stoff got especially hysterical when she heard that all of Vienna's 21 synagogues were attacked, the fires and bombs mostly destroying them. Through her sobs, she shared that several were located near their home district and fretted about her mother, who was still living there. Mr. Stoff kept repeating, "Mein Gott," his arm wrapped tightly around his wife as they all sat in shock. It was one of the few times Eli wasn't smiling, his expression somber as he stood behind his parents, his hand on their shoulders. Emma and Simon Goldstein were first-generation Americans, so Herschel never heard anything but English at home, except for the occasional Yiddish expression, oy vey, chutzpah, klutz, kvel, thrown in for embellishment. They'd met in Cleveland, where all his grandparents had settled at the turn of the century. His mother's family came from Latvia, Papa's from Russia. After his parents married in 1922, they moved to Columbus so his father could join his uncle Jacob in his kosher meat business in the Jewish section of town, the East End. Soon, more immigrants arrived needing work. The Depression hit, and times became hard for everyone. Herschel was too young to be aware of any of that, but he clearly remembered when his mother opened a shop just a block from their house on 571 Rich Street. It became a hub for the neighborhood, where the refugee women's baking and sewing skills could earn them a small income. He knew because he practically grew up there. Living in such close quarters, Herschel saw how hard those early weeks were for the Stoffs, mostly for Eli's mother. Because of her command of English, she'd been an English teacher in Vienna. She was the one reaching out to landlords to find them a place of their own. She kept telling Herschel's mother she didn't want to be a burden. The discrimination toward foreigners, and especially Jewish immigrants like Lila, doors literally slammed in her face alongside the horrors in Europe. They all wore on her. They wore on the household. But after their tumultuous arrival, the Stoffs began to feel part of the community. Mrs. Stoff joined the cadre of bakers at 571 and got to know many of the women in the neighborhood. Mr. Stoff got a job as a stockman in a uniform company where his broken English almost fit in. On Sundays, Herschel's parents played canasta with Eli's, and he and Eli, sometimes with Meyer in tow, spend much of their free time together. Eli finishes high school and then attends Ohio State University. By his junior year, the war efforts is in full swing, and Eli joins the U.S. Army, first with the 10th Mountain Division in Colorado, but he ends up at a training center called Camp Ritchie. I'd like to offer some context for you about Camp Ritchie. Some of this will sound familiar because it was captured in the 60 Minutes segment. In the summer of 1942, the Army, U.S. Army, centralized its intelligence operation at Camp Ritchie because it was a perfect remote location in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was about 17 miles from Hagerstown, Maryland, and about 70 miles from Washington, D.C. So the camp, which was founded by the Maryland National Guard, became the Army's secret intelligence training facility. Most men were assigned to Camp Ritchie because of their fluency in German or other languages. They were often recent immigrants to the United States, often Jews who fled Nazi persecution, and they were familiar with the culture and thinking of enemy soldiers, as I mentioned earlier. At Camp Ritchie, the young men took part in an intensive course of instruction that lasted up to 6 months. The Army trained recruits to be interrogators of prisoners of war, where they were taught the order of battle book, all of it memorized so it could never be found if they were captured. They learned Morse code, identification of aerial photos in order to find installations, document interpretation and analysis, and much more. From the time it opened in 1942 to the end of World War II, more than 15,000 servicemen trained at Camp Ritchie, and more than 2,000 of them were Jewish refugees born in Germany and Austria. One Army study estimates that 60% of the intelligence collected in Europe came from interrogations conducted by Ritchie Boys. In a story in my novel called Camp Ritchie, I feature 3 cabin mates who Eli Stoff becomes close with. I found a photo in one of my father's Army albums of him with 3 other young men. All of them looked to be in their early 20s. And from this image, I imagined the characters that are in this story: Henry White, Bobby Saltman, and Max Schultz, the Army friends Eli would meet during military intelligence training. The way these 4 men posed in this photograph conjured up the camaraderie that I wrote into the scenes that filled this particular story. I'm often asked why I've chosen to retell family history as fiction, given that my first novel, Tassa's Song, was inspired by my mother's early life, and A Ritchie Boy was inspired by my father's. As a first-generation Jewish American whose parents escaped Nazi-controlled Europe during the Holocaust, I've always been acutely aware of the extraordinary circumstances that were part of each of my parents' early lives. Just like my character, Eli Stoff, my dad and his parents barely escaped from Vienna in 1938. And my father later returned to the theater of war as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. My mom came from a tiny village in eastern Poland and hid in an underground bunker for a year during the height of the war before she arrived in this country at the age of 24, which was in 1947. I knew my parents and grandparents were driven from their homeland because of religious persecution. It made me more conscious of how easily the hatred toward people less understood can spread. My parents' experiences also made me value our histories, our stories, and the importance of remembrance. There were many heroes who saved people like my parents, despite the anti-Semitism around them. Knowing about these heroes has instilled in me a gratitude for those who have the courage to stand up for what they believe, to not turn away from the trouble they see. As my mom and dad got older, their stories became even more precious to me. I realized that each of my parents had been a witness to a piece of history that would disappear unless their unique and human stories were retold. I came to the page with 9 questions and a curiosity about their individual life journeys, what gave them their determination to begin again in a new culture. While I had a timeline of their lives, I was not a witness to their day-to-day experiences and relationships. I couldn't know their feelings or reactions to the events as they happened. I could say their history was marked by persecution, by family love, resilience, and survival, but I wasn't there. So I chose to make this a human story told through fictional devices that allow you, as the reader, to inhabit my characters. In many ways, fiction allows the telling of a larger truth because it allows the reader to experience and be present in that human narrative. For a moment, I'd like to talk about the structure of my book that I alluded to earlier as a cohesive linked narrative. And I've also called it a novel in stories. And these stories are told by different characters. Together, these individual stories follow Eli's journey from 1938 to 1948. The novel's structure offers a portrait of a time as well as of a man caught up in its turmoil. Theoretically, each of A Ritchie Boy's chapters can be read as standalone stories, all linked to Eli stuff and related to this period of our history that's set during the dawn of World War II and the disruptive decade to follow. Two of my stories, in fact, were published in literary journals prior to the publication of my book, including one of those two in the Jewish Literary Journal. Also, you should know, I didn't write the stories in the order they appear in this book, but I did arrange them chronologically for the book to give it a very novel-like presentation. The variety of voices telling these stories, in effect, allow the reader to see Eli Stoff from many angles. An example is the early story I mentioned, Zelda's Gamble, told from Zelda's point of view. And the story I read from, where Eli's first American friend, Herschel Goldstein, tells that story. Each story is told by the variety of people who Eli interacts with during this decade of his life. A couple of the stories are in Eli's voice. There have been other novels structured in this manner, and the most well-known, which I can't compare it myself to when I tell you, it was a Pulitzer Prize winner by Elizabeth Strout. It was called Olive Kittredge. So I'm not inventing this structure, but it hasn't been done a lot. When you read historical fiction, you might wonder, how is the writer able to create such a reality of time and place long ago and far away? And many want to know about the research. They ask me a lot about, what research did I conduct? And believe me, historical novelists must do a great deal of research to create a verisimilitude on the page for the reader. Before beginning a book like mine, there's the research about the time period covered, about the settings, and then about the context or the backdrop, like a world war. And that includes understanding what foods people ate, what characters wore, what they read, the music they listened to, any concrete particulars to ground the story and create that authenticity for the reader. The primary source for my book, A Ritchie Boy, was my father. I knew about the basic facts of his life because I audio taped interviews with him when I was in my late 20s. It wasn't long after I earned a graduate degree in journalism in the late 1970s. I was armed with several years of experience writing for magazines, and I assumed the role of family historian with great fervor. I suddenly gave myself the assignment of interviewing both of my parents to ensure that my children and grandchildren would understand where they came from. Most of all, I needed to understand my heritage. I audio taped these conversations, hoping that an objective approach with prepared questions would finally connect the dots of my family history. My parents shared what they remembered, but as I tapped their words on my IBM Selectric, I still ended up with gaps, and much later, thought of all the questions I could have asked. I also realized that there likely was trauma embedded in these memories they had, and that forgetting some things might have been useful for my parents to move forward. For many years, my typewritten facts remained in a drawer. I had many other sources of information as I developed the stories in my novel. Given my background and knowing the unique circumstances my parents endured, I really have had a lifelong fascination with books and films about World War II and the Holocaust. So some things I just knew. When I began to write this novel, my research included reading lots of historical documents. I explored more than 100 internet sources that linked to relevant articles. I read a number of books about the Ritchie Boys. I read about Jewish soldiers during World War II. One was actually called GI Jews. And I also read about life of Jewish immigrants in America and actually found a book called Jews and Judaism in a Midwestern Community that featured Columbus, where Eli and his family settled, as did my father. I watched some dramatic films, and most importantly, and interesting that 60 Minutes just did this segment, but in 2004, there was one documentary about the Ritchie Boys, and I found that, and it helped me to better understand the training facility at Camp Ritchie and the techniques that were learned there. You should know that the 3 surviving Ritchie Boys featured in the 60 Minutes segment had been featured, at least 2 of them, I think all 3 had been featured in this documentary from 2004 as well. In my research, I obviously used Google search when I needed to be efficient, but wherever possible, I spoke with experts to ensure accuracy. One of my early readers was a university professor of European history. There was an endless amount of detailed facts I needed to understand. I had to research skiing techniques as well as the particulars of alpine skiing back in the late 30s to write a story about Eli's ski trip with classmates in the Australian Alps that begins the book. I explored the kinds of music the characters might listen to during this time. 7 of the 12 stories in A Ritchie Boy feature different kinds of music: classical, big band hits, bebop, even songs from Broadway musicals of that period. I had to understand the local geography of New York City, of Columbus, and other locations where the stories were set, as well as the cultural norms of that time period. I learned about the details around the arrival and review process at Ellis Island, about the life on the campus of Ohio State University as the country prepared for war. I learned about the life in Shanghai for Jews during World War II for one of the later stories whose lead character emigrated there to escape the Holocaust, and even the nuances of a professional photographer back then, who is my narrator in the final story. I've been to Vienna and New York, and I live in Columbus, but I know those cities today. My stories are set between 1938 and 1948, as I told you. Probably the most interesting research that I did was reading 2 full years, 1942 and 1943, of the Ohio State University Lantern, the college newspaper that still exists today. Eli attended Ohio State, a campus that, living in Columbus, I've been to numerous times, but I needed to learn what it was like then as our country prepared for war. I found one of the biggest challenges is dealing with research for a novel whose backdrop is so huge and universally known, as is World War II. The writer has to make sure the historical facts and details of a past era ring true, but not overpower the story itself, because in the end, in fiction, we're telling story through what our characters think, feel, say, and do. And all of that is imagined. I'd love to entertain your questions really at this time. I think I've talked long enough.
Thank you very much. And so we have a number of questions. First, let me go to the chat room, and then we'll ask any questions we have here in person. So the first question comes from, I just got that. One question here from Chuck. How much research did you have to do about Camp Ritchie, and how cooperative was the U.S. Army?
Okay, thank you for that question. I kind of got into the research. I really didn't talk to the U.S. Army. I didn't need to, because I as I mentioned, had watched that documentary on Camp Ritchie, and I also read a number of other books. And there was a book that included some really valuable information, a nonfiction book that included some valuable information about Camp Ritchie. And, you know, I had interviewed my father, so I had firsthand information about what it was like at Camp Ritchie. So I had enough information, and I really and had Googled some other articles from through the Army, et cetera. I really didn't need to call or talk to them because I was writing a book of fiction, and I had certainly way more facts than I needed for my book.
Linda Howard's asking, the book makes it seems like there were a lot of Jews escaping to Shanghai, China. Is that still a large community today?
You know, I didn't really research, you know, how large the community is today, because I was really spending all my time in 1938 and 1948. So I can't answer that. I would assume there are a number of, you know, Jews still there, but I would imagine that many of them, like the character in my novel, and frankly, a relative, I had several relatives that did leave Vienna and ended up in Shanghai for a decade. So I think a lot of them finally left Shanghai in the late 40s.
That makes sense. Any questions here in person? Ron? Let me bring the mic to you so Linda can hear you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the 60-minute program, but my question is, when the Jewish interrogators spoke to the German prisoners, I would guess that the Germans knew or assumed that they were Jewish, in fact. Did your father ever comment on that? Whether their mannerisms, their vocabulary, whatever.
Mm-hmm. We didn't talk about that, actually. There's a story, actually, and it was the first one of the earlier stories I wrote, but it happens to be in this novel. It fits in about the beginning of the second half, called The Interrogation. And I imagined a scene that took place outside of Paris following Battle of the Bulge. And back then it was known as the Ardennes counteroffensive. And what was happening, and what my father told me about some interrogations, because he was stationed in a suburb called Le Vizinay outside of Paris. And that's why I set the story there, because that part of it was true. He had indicated that, you know, so many, you know, escaped the battle. It wasn't known as Battle of the Bulge then, as I said, but they escaped that and filtered into Paris. And it was their job to sort of finger these imposters who basically took uniforms off of dead soldiers to, you know, impersonate someone from some other country, even a United States, you know, uniform. And so my father was in Paris, and he was finding these individuals and interrogating them. Whether they knew he, you know, was Jewish or not, you know, I don't know. I mean, my father and these gentlemen actually that were in the 60 Minutes program, you know, they spoke fluent German, you know, and I don't know that there would be a differentiation between how they spoke German to how, you know, someone else who was born in Germany spoke German. I just don't know the answer to that. I would think that, you know, in some cases they may, but in many cases they wouldn't, you know.
Sergio.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I'm going to certainly read the book. At what point did your father come out with a story, or were they told by the Army to be secretive?
He never said that the Army had, told him to be secretive. I think because, I interviewed my dad and he told me very factually about, his 6-man team and how they were, where they were trained and all the very concrete facts of his experience. He told me the bare minimum of what I asked him. He never went beyond that. I have to think, without me asking him, as I grew up, there was only one thing he ever shared on his own with us. And that had to do with his deep gratitude to the man. And there was a man who, sight unseen, took responsibility for my dad and his parents and agreed to give them to send affidavits to sponsor them so they could escape from Vienna just after the Anschluss. So my dad mentioned that as I was growing up. I remember distinctly, he talked about that experience and why he my dad was extremely philanthropic. In the beginning of our lives, he gave of his time. And when he did better later on, he gave of his treasure. And the idea of giving back was really embedded in him because of this particular experience and his deep gratitude to this man. In real life, this man, there was someone who knew my grandmother, who found someone who was a wealthy Chicago businessman. In my book, she was a dear friend of my grandmother's, and she lived in New York, and it was a New York businessman. So, I altered things as I, wrote the fiction, but the essence of the story of what happened to my father.
Did he stay close to the other Ritchie boys?
He lost touch with them. My dad was the kind of man who, he sort of moved on at all stages of his life. I even saw that late in his life when, after he retired, he had a law degree and he never used it. He ended up, for various circumstances that happened, he had been working his way through law school in a small business, and the proprietor died suddenly. And the wife asked my father to buy into this small business. And so he stayed with it and hadn't practiced as an attorney. And yet after he retired, he sort of took refresher courses and started to volunteer his services, and he did arbitration and whatnot. And he just kind of moved into that, and later, much later, when my mother, wasn't doing very well, he became her caregiver. And after she passed away, in the short amount of time that he was alive after she died, he kind of went into that phase of his life too, always with grace, always looking forward, and always not looking back. And I just, I just think that that's just how he conducted himself, to answer your question.
Any other questions here? Give you the mic. Last question here, and then we got one more online. Speak loud.
This is more of a comment, but I did watch 60 Minutes, and it made me very proud to be Jewish, because those weren't just any men. You also had to be very intelligent, high IQ. I noticed, how many people saw 60 Minutes, that episode? Very few. I watch 60 Minutes all the time. But my comment is, my wife and I went to Germany in 2017 and had a wonderful vacation. We drove our car from Hamburg down to Bavaria. I played golf in Hamburg, down to Bavaria. And in Berlin, we went to, we call it the Holocaust Museum. There they call it the Museum to the Murdered Jews of Europe.
Yeah. I've been there.
And when I was there, my wife went off. So I was talking to one of the young men that kind of showed people around. I said, well, tell us about the Holocaust. What do you do to educate people or whatever? And he goes, starting in 3rd grade, they start teaching about the Holocaust. That's 12th grade. And I said, well, what's the bottom line? Kind of, he goes, well, people need to, and talk about timing. He said, people need to understand that they can be manipulated by the government and politicians. That's what he tried to teach the students. And timing is like, this is 60 minutes. And, usually in the Holocaust, I guess we always say, you should remain silent. And as we see, I just got to bring up timing today. Liz Cheney in Washington was kicked out of her position of authority because she wanted to speak the truth and not go with the big lie that the presidential election was stolen. And she said something to the effect that those who ignore the lie embolden the liar. So, and democracy is it's in danger. And as Jews, we need to protect democracy, just not for Jews, but for everybody.
Earlier in my comments, I talked about the many heroes that, despite all the anti-Semitism that existed at that time and that there were many courageous people that were there to save the Jews, and they weren't all Jewish either. And it's those people that, people have to speak out, and they've got to, step up.
I wanted to share a story. I went to Vienna, my wife, and we visited the big synagogue there that's really like the #1 synagogue. That rabbi, the government calls him, and it was really an amazing place. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I said, how can you do this? He said, well, the government and the city, the country and the city gave us an unlimited amount of money to build this the way we wanted to. And so, it was awestruck. But I said, yeah, but that looks very, very good that you would be able to have money, because money, you can't solve what happened. And so the rabbi looked at me, he said, you're right. Upstairs, we have a museum of the synagogues that were destroyed during that time period. And then he said, and also for our government, whenever we have a program, we have a rabbi, a priest, and a minister. And I got to understand the difference of problems they had between the Catholics and the Protestants. And then he said to me, you really think that doesn't mean it? It's show to have somebody up on the stage. He said, but let me tell you, our members actually have to go through almost like a master's degree, learning about the Holocaust. He says, because all the schools are required to come here. They come in various times of their ages. And there's always the first, second, and third question these young kids ask. Who is a Jew? What is a Jew? The second thing is, what did we do during that thing you're calling the Holocaust? What did our people do? And the third one, how have we made up for it? And the final thing I want to say, here at our Holocaust Museum, I ran into a young man. His father had just died, and I was with a docent there. She's very well known, still alive today, thank God. But she said to me, we have this young man going back to Austria tomorrow, and do you mind if he comes to dinner with us? Fine. I looked at him. I said, what's it like being a Jew in Austria? He says, no, sir, I am not a Jew. He said, when we get to be 18 years old, we have a choice. We can go in the army, we can do public service, but if there's an opening in a Holocaust museum, we can volunteer to go there. And that's what he was doing. He was working in our Holocaust Museum, telling his story and being around people. It was just very, very telling for me, and hearing the way in which they have adopted to that. It was a wonderful trip. And the street, Judasstraten. I couldn't forget that. Anyway, thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Your story is very personal, and I think you're very, very lucky that your parents would convey you this information. My parents and family left in 1939 from Germany. Two brothers and three sisters. They were scattered. They went to Shanghai. They ended up in Argentina, ended up in the United States, in the Midwest, because that's where the person that signed their affidavit was. However, they absolutely did not want to talk about their experiences in Germany. And I have heard that that is very, very common of that generation.
Yeah, no.
You're lucky.
Yeah.
My parents would never talk about it.
Yeah.
They changed their name when they came to this country. My father was unbelievably patriotic to the United States. And for their entire life, they absolutely refused to return to Germany. They wanted nothing to do with that. They were very prominent, that whole family were prominent Jews in Berlin. They lost everything, started over in the United States. They wouldn't talk about it, none of them.
Yeah, you're right. That's much more common. And as I mentioned, my dad was not forthcoming. He was really just like, let's move forward, let's move on. He really didn't talk about it to anyone very much. If they asked, there were newspapers that somehow they learned, and someone, wrote something that he had that background. He had received a Bronze Star during his time, with the Army. But, he really didn't talk about, battle. I'm sure that the Ritchie Boys fought also. They weren't just interrogating and analyzing. I mean, they had to come to he mentioned that, but he never really talked about it and didn't want to talk about it. My mom talked a lot more, and frankly, her experience, in Eastern Poland, where she grew up, was, when it got bad, it was terrible. She was under the Soviets for 2 years when Stalin and Hitler made their deal. And then under the Germans. She was fortunately never was in a concentration camp, but she lived underground for a year. A Catholic family had built a bunker under their barn, and they were able to remain safe, but quite fearful situation. So, I was surprised at how much she did share with me, but my dad didn't. I think a lot of the men who fought in World War II didn't talk a lot about the experience.
Last two questions. Howard Sherman's asking, the photographer at the end did a photo portrait of the family for Life magazine. Was that real or fiction?
That was fiction.
And then Bernice is asking, I understand there's a Ritchie Boys Museum in DC. I wonder if you've had any experience with it as a resource.
Online only. I did not go into that museum. I was in some other museums, but not that one.
And then Jerry Winder has a relative, his father, I believe, was a Ritchie Boy. Jerry, you want to spend a moment just telling us about that to end our presentation?
Okay. Thank you, Linda, for your story. My father's story is very similar. He's also from Vienna, and he escaped and went to England and was in the Lord Kitchener camp there and applied for visas all over the world, wherever he could find a Winder, he sent out and requested visas. And a man in Pittsburgh, whose last name was Winder, but he was adopted when his father died when he was very young. His mother remarried a Winder and was adopted, and he signed the affidavit. This man was a physicist and was on the Manhattan Project.
Mm-hmm.
And my father then came over on the Canard Line and was sent without a penny in his pocket. The Jewish agency in New York sent him to Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he worked for a Jewish family there in a produce business. And then he enlisted in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Since he was not a citizen, he was put in the medical corps and sent to San Antonio, There he met my mother, who was from a small town outside of Fort Worth called Alvarado, but she had relatives in San Antonio, and they got married. And then my father was sent to Camp Ritchie, and it's kind of an unusual story because my father and my mother never told us what they were there for. Now then, next to the Manhattan Project, the Ritchie Boys was the second most secretive program in the United States at the time. No, and they were bound to secrecy. So my father, and it just came about, that in the 1990s that it became declassified. So the only story that my mother told us, because she was at Camp Ritchie at the same time as with my father, and she was an elementary school teacher. Now you have to understand that if you flunked out of being a Ritchie boy, you were immediately sent back to your company, that your unit that you were in. My father told my mother that he was being sent overseas. My mother, as she said, was an elementary school teacher, and she was teaching the officers' children. And so one day when she found out that my father was going to be going overseas, she told her class that she's going back to Texas because her husband's being shipped overseas. Well, a little girl in the class went crying home to her dad that she's losing her favorite teacher. Well, her dad was the general of the camp, and he canceled the orders. So he never left Camp Ritchie. And that's really the only story that my brother and I ever heard. And one day my wife was flipping through the channels and hit the military channel and saw that program, that documentary that Linda referenced, and she yelled at me to come here. And I found out about the Ritchie Boys. I had no idea really what he was doing there. And then there's a book called Sons and Soldiers, which we tried to get Bruce Henderson last year, but it was too prohibitive. And he mainly dealt with the German Jews coming out of and going into the Ritchie Boys. And so I talked to him. After that documentary, I called Guy Stern. I called all of them, said, "Did you know my dad?" And because I had no idea how many people were going through the program. They said there were hundreds, thousands going through constantly. But Bruce Henderson got me in touch with the man who did his research. And I found out exactly when my father was there, what he was doing while he was there, because he didn't leave. And I always wondered why my father had all this Army surplus photographic paper. Well, he was doing photography for the camp and mimeographing. And my mother, as a side note, my mother did say, and nobody mentions this, that there were a lot of either Broadway or Hollywood stars there that kept out of the war there. And because she said they had the best programs ever going on at the Ritchie Boys. So so I have a lot of questions because my father never talked about it. I don't know if he regretted not going back, as a lot of them did, and they wanted to go back to try to find their family.
Yeah.
There's so many questions that I have that I will never get answered. So you are very lucky, Linda, that you were able to get that information.
Well, a funny story you made me think of, Jerry, and it was nice talking to you on the phone the other day, by the way. I knew my dad, obviously trained at Camp Ritchie, but it wasn't until 2014 or so when I was sitting in his living room and he threw a letter on my lap and he says, "Look at this." And it was a letter inviting him. It said, "Dear Ritchie Boy." And it was a letter inviting him to a reunion of the Ritchie Boys. And somehow I had I knew about Camp Ritchie, but I never knew there was a name for what he was or what he did. I never knew that. So that was really at that point when I left his apartment and I Googled Ritchie Boys, and I came up with that documentary that your wife saw. And that's when I first saw that and learned that there were thousands of them. And that's when I just started, pulling all this information. I already had information from my dad. I asked him more and started working on these stories because it was just so intriguing to me. But I didn't really, all these years, didn't know that there was a name for them.
I had no idea either.
Mm-hmm.
And we did go back to Vienna when I was in middle school, and my father took us to where he lived, and there was a vacant lot. It was the only vacant lot for anywhere around there, and that's where the synagogue was. And the buildings had bullet holes in them. Mm-hmm. And he asked somebody, he said, "Why don't they get this repaired?" He said, "Well, they can't find the owners. It had to be 50 years after the war before they could repair the buildings."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jerry, thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, we went back.
Let's give a big round of applause to Linda. Linda, thank you very much. I know Paul sent out information, gave us information on to buy your book. I know it sounds like a really fascinating book, and we wish you only success in your research, and we hope to meet you in person one day. I also want to, of course, thank Paul. I want to thank Andy Berger and Jennifer Rosenzweig for all the technology that went into making this happen. Let's give them a big round of applause. Not easy, so thank you for all your hard work. And Linda, again, we hope to see you soon. And guys, hope to see everyone soon, whether it's services or another program. And of course, 100 Jewish Men starting up again in the fall. Erev Tov, everyone. Good evening.
Thank you so much.